I want to start tonight by telling you about my friend Ahmad, who I met in 2008 when he was applying for the Emmanuel House program, which my wife and I had just started with the help of a network of local nonprofits, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. Ahmad's family had 3 kids, 2 working parents who were working opposite shift jobs, one the night shift, one the day shift, to meet the needs of their family, week in and week out, month to month, in a tough economy, but getting by. They were paying their bills, but with no realistic opportunity to accumulate any kind of meaningful savings. They wanted to buy a house, but banks had mostly stopped lending, especially to families that were just making $30,000 a year. Ahmad and his wife Maysoon are some of the hardest working, deserving, capable people that I know. But they were stuck in a monthly cycle, a cycle that put them at a disadvantage, and where all their energies had to be internally focused on just staying current with their month-to-month existence. And unfortunately, we know from long-term social research that this cycle is not only hard for most working families to ever overcome, but it's a generational cycle that is statistically certain to repeat itself in the overwhelming number of poor families. But it's not just the families and the future generations of families who suffer from a self-perpetuating cycle of disadvantage. We all do. Not only are there tax burden implications, but the bigger and less often recognized loss to communities comes from the fact that there are hundreds or thousands of families who would be great business owners, stable homeowners, building wealth and helping to create jobs and stability within our own communities. But we've handicapped ourselves by categorizing some people as poor and placing them outside of the solution. They are the problem. They need help fixing what they can't fix themselves, and we've relegated too many people to be recipients of aid, as opposed to realizing the greatest untapped resource that already exists in every community, which is entire subpopulations of people who've neither been asked nor empowered to become part of a growth solution. So let me give you an interesting global example of what I'm talking about. In the year 2000, the US economy produced roughly 3 times that of the Chinese economy. And since 2000, the number of people in China who are living under the World Bank's measure of extreme poverty of $1.25 a day shrunk from an astounding 450 million people to just 84 million. And the number of people living on less than $2.50 a day shrank from 900 million to 360. And those are some dramatic numbers of hundreds of millions of Chinese who are being lifted out of extreme poverty and gaining more purchasing power that led to a very dramatic result, which was that in those same 14 years, China's economy practically tripled in size and edged out the United States as the world's largest economy in terms of production of goods and services, knocking the US from that perch for the first time in 140 years. Now, China still struggles with growing now in income inequality, and 2/3 of their population, 900 million people, still live on less than $5 a day. And while that's somewhat hard to compare, America certainly has our own growing income inequality problems, and one could argue that we've actually had a harder time when it comes to reducing the number of people who fall below our own poverty line. 51 years ago, President Lyndon Johnson declared an unconditional war on poverty. Now, in the area of senior citizens, we've seen some dramatic drops in the poverty level, where our society has essentially supported expensive safety net programs that have made a difference. But for nearly every other population, the attempted solutions to poverty reduction haven't moved the dial. And poverty rates for many groups has actually risen, negating all of the gains in poverty reduction for seniors. So while we started with an overall 14.7% poverty rate in Illinois in 1960, 52 years later, we're at 14.7%. And as problematic as these income measurements are, we have even greater inequality and greater drivers of non-participation in the economy when it comes to our wealth gap. So prior to the economic downturn, what we saw was some growth and some catch-up in the wealth gap. But since the downturn, we saw that there was actually a widening of that gap again, so that now the typical white family in America has 18 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic or black family. And we already had some very high concentrations of wealth where the top 10% had essentially 3/4 of the wealth in our society. The bottom 80% had just the orange and red that you see there, 15%, and the bottom 40% essentially had no wealth whatsoever. And since the recession, the Great Recession, what we've seen is that we've seen this, the study after study that have shown that nearly 95% of all of the economic gains since the Great Recession have gone to the top 1%, and the 400 richest Americans now have more wealth than all 41 million African Americans combined. And up to this point, I think these problems have persisted or grown because we've primarily been presented with poverty alleviation strategies that say that the answer is either in getting the poor to take on greater personal responsibility or in providing more and more aid and assistance to the poor. But I think there's a third way. There's this African proverb that I heard that stuck with me that says that the hand that receives is always on the bottom. So several years ago, we assembled a group of churches and nonprofits to try to change that dynamic and to help more people reach their natural ability to become contributors. And we quickly zeroed in on helping lower-income families move from being renters to homeowners, not only because it increased stability within neighborhoods and schools, but primarily because it was a way to begin to equip families to offer more opportunities to their children and the entire community. And when we look back at the largest drivers of the racial wealth gap and a lack of access to home ownership opportunities, statistically, the single largest driver in creating and sustaining that gap was a lack of opportunity to own a home. And with the rise in popularity of renting, the New York Times recently cited a Harvard study showing that whether or not one is a homeowner is the single biggest predictor of wealth, and concluded that there still is simply no better means or alternative to building wealth than home ownership. The typical or median homeowner is 36 times wealthier than the typical renter. And even when you control for age, race, and income, you could have two families making the same amount of money, and the homeowner will be statistically 12 times wealthier. Now, the problem is that for working class renting families, their largest expense year after year is rent. And at $800 to $1,000 per month, depending on how many bedrooms your family needs, that results in $10,000 to $12,000 every year with nothing to show for it, let alone at the end of 10 years when you have $100,000 or $120,000 of earned income and nothing to show. Now in Aurora, Illinois, consider this is a community with 200,000 people. And about 20% of the households there earn between $25,000 to $45,000 per year. And I think it's safe to assume that the overwhelming majority of these families are both working and renting. And with a median rent of about $850, these households are paying about $125 million in collective rent each year, which means that every 8 years, these families are paying $1 billion in rent with absolutely no created wealth to show for it. And even though the typical mortgage payment is no higher than the typical rent payment, in Aurora, statistically speaking, each of these renting families is likely to have a net worth that hovers somewhere just above or just below $0. So what Emmanuel House did is we created a temporary disruption to the normal outflow of income from lower income families. And instead of their largest expenditure perpetually going to pay for their apartment, we got some apartments that we're running more efficiently with the help of a network of churches and dedicated volunteers, other nonprofit partners, and double bottom line investors who are helping us to buy homes, earning a financial bottom line for themselves and a social bottom line for Emmanuel House and the rest of the community. And they've helped us grow from 5 apartments to nearly 20 apartments in just the past few years. Now, these were all, for the most part, existing resources in the community that we've bundled together to create efficiencies that we can then pass on to our participant families who pay the same rent that they would otherwise, but with substantial amounts of that money that we can divert into savings accounts that they own. Meanwhile, our nonprofit partners provide wraparound services, financial literacy, and credit boosting activities so that at the end of 18 to 24 months, families who couldn't have previously qualified for their own mortgage do qualify. And it's working. And we've gone from 2 or 3 or 4 homeowners every year, and we're on track now to start creating 20 or 30 or 40 homeowners every year in the not too distant future. And those are nice sounding numbers, at least they are to me. But long term, I think that those numbers of new homeowners will grossly undercount the overall impact on the community once these families are now equipped and empowered to more fully participate in the economy and become strengtheners not only of their own families, but of the entire community, as whole sets of opportunities to contribute now open up to them. So I want to go back to my friend Ahmad and his family who were previously stuck in a month-to-month cycle. A year and a half after entering our program, they bought their first home in Aurora, and the next 5 years, Ahmad has started his own exporting business on the side. He's now looking at expanding that with the equity in his home. He has 2 kids who are now in college. Ahmad's serving on the Emmanuel House board. He and his family are making monthly financial contributions to Emmanuel House to help the next families. And he just told me that they're looking into the possibility of upgrading their 1,400 square foot starter home. Now, Ahmad still works in the same second shift factory job that he did when I met him. So in some ways, from a day-to-day routine, one could say that not that much has changed. But in most ways, everything's changed. He's contributing not only internally to the value of to his family, but he's contributing externally to the entire community in so many ways. And having more working class families, even if they're lower income, contributing creates new community wealth, a lot of which can be brought about, as I said, by bundling a lot of existing services and partnering together. And more invested homeowners have access to credit and more disposable income. Consequently, businesses are more likely to locate in a community with higher rates of homeownership, which leads to a stronger tax base, lowering the tax burden on working families, creating more funding for better schools, better educational outcomes, and so on. And this also frees up and creates more resources for those who've experienced deeper and longer and more multifaceted challenges from more extreme poverty. The working poor are the low-hanging fruit to change the wealth and resources available to community development strategies. So what if we activated more families to more fully participate in our local and national economy and unleashed that latent potential that lives within each person to make their own contributions to the common good? What if we leveraged some significant portion of that $1 billion in Aurora, which also exists elsewhere, that currently isn't creating wealth for any of those who earned it? Could we triple the size of our economy in 14 years? The way that China did? Could we regain the title of the world's largest economy? Well, that might still be an awfully tall order. But the reason I think nobody's daring to dream such ambitious goals is that we've still yet to discover the power of the working poor to take our local economies to these next levels. And this is still a work in progress. We have a whole lot more discovering to do. But let's not repeat the same mistakes of the past 51 years of policies that have moved our poverty rates exactly nowhere. Let's try this different, more inclusive strategy in all of our development endeavors. As Dr. Maynard Caliendo of North Central College said about this approach, this is neither a liberal or conservative idea. It's neither Democratic nor Republican. It's human. It's loving, it's smart, and it can work. So let's try that.